Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. Tonight, I want to talk a little bit about the underlying ideas and concepts behind the Stalinist purges, and we're going to look a little bit at the purges of the late 1930s and the show trials. But I want to talk a bit about more everyday processes of purging that were integral to Stalinism, and that helps to make the horrors of the Great Terror far more comprehensible and makes them far less kind of an aberration to the normal course of Stalinism and far less of a kind of a unique feature of Stalinism. Now, as I've mentioned earlier in previous podcasts, I'm an enormous fan of the works of Sheila Fitzpatrick and Stephen Kotkin. And those two historians particularly give a very rich and very detailed view of everyday life in Stalinist Russia. And I think that when you start to engage with the everyday and look at the lived experience of ordinary Russians or ordinary Stalinists, as Sheila Fitzpatrick puts it, you see a kind of a much broader picture and a much more detailed picture than the kind of the normal focus that Soviet historians have always had, or historians of the Soviet Union, I should say, on high politics and looking at the machinations of kind of party members. This is an approach that I really like, but obviously understanding the workings of Stalin's inner circle is obviously very important too. In Everyday Stalinism, Sheila Fitzpatrick says that one of the most important aspects of understanding the party and the party's relationship with society was to understand the kind of the rituals of the party. The party had various aspects which of practice and theory that was sacrosanct, and one of these was the periodic cleansing of the party, the removal from the party of undesirables. Now, in a regime that is based on a siege mentality and based on the obsession with fifth columnists, not that before the mid-1930s the term fifth columnist existed, but was obsessed with internal enemies, saw everything in terms of the dialectics of class, and knew that the old enemy classes hadn't been sufficiently eliminated yet, and they were still sort of there. And this was an ideology that believed that unless a kind of a profound existential transformation had taken place in an individual to proletarianize them, that they would be harbouring dangerous bourgeois thoughts. The metaphor within Soviet discourse of the mask, of understanding what lies behind the mask and what lies behind the public persona and exists in the privacy of private thought, was a trope that's kind of trotted out time and time again in Soviet writing of the era, and being able to expose the individual, the inner life of the individual, to the purifying will of the collective. This was seen as one way in which you can, or the most effective way, in which you can help get rid of these sort of nasty bourgeois thoughts that are selfish and self-centered and designed to destroy socialism in the long run. But because this wasn't always effective, it was assumed that dubious types had infiltrated the party, and the party was the route to career advancement. It was the route to accessing resources, and particularly food and shelter, both of which are scarcities in Stalinist Russia. So it wasn't just the party hierarchy, the top brass, people like Stalin, that believed that the party should always be on the lookout for dubious types. Through every tier of the party, there was an obsession that people with bourgeois ideas and people with bad class origins who had been perhaps related to the aristocracy or the government bureaucracy, or had been their relatives had been part of the White Armies, or later on that their relatives were kulaks. The people with bad class origins would eventually have to be weeded out. So from 1928 onwards, in across government departments and agencies, there would be periodic reviews of the employees there, and periodic reviews within the party of party membership. There would be a kind of an autobiography that the individual would have to write, which would be carefully scrutinised and held up against other documents that were written down about that individual. And this would be followed by an interrogation by a commission, a purge commission, and the questions would deal with nearly any aspect of the person's personal life or political life. In Everyday Stalinism, Sheila Fitzpatrick lists some of the questions. What was the individual doing before 1917 and the October Revolution? Were they at the front during the Civil War? Were they ever arrested before the revolution? Did they have any disagreements in the party? Are you a drinker? What do you think about Bukharin and the right deviation? What do you think about kulaks, the 5-year plans, events in China? Is it true that you own a private automobile and you have a pretty wife who is also an actress? Do you get married in church? Is your son baptized? Who did your sister marry? And you can already get the impression from this that unless somebody had perfect answers and unblemished class credentials and a perfect revolutionary track record before the revolution, then they were going to be at the very least a suspect. It was designed in the kind of typical Stalinist dragnet method of, if you wind up throwing 100 innocent men out of the party and you catch one guilty one, well, that's good odds. Sheila Fitzpatrick goes on to describe the memoirs of Elena Bonner, who was the wife of Andrei Sakharov. And in her childhood, she recalled a purge at the offices of the Communist International, Comintern. Her stepfather, Gevorg Alekhanov, worked at the Comintern, and purge meetings were held each evening after work over a period of weeks in the red corner of the Hotel Lux, where the Alekhanov-Bonner family and other Comintern officials lived. Yelena and other Comintern children hid behind the curtains and eavesdropped. And she writes, this is Yelena Bonner, "You could see that they were nervous. They asked about people's wives and sometimes about the children. It turned out that some people beat their wives and drank a lot of vodka. Batanya, Yelena Bonner's grandmother, would have said that decent people don't ask such questions. Sometimes the one being purged said that he wouldn't beat his wife anymore or drink anymore. And a lot of them said about their work that they wouldn't do it anymore, and they understood everything." The expectation was that the individual who was being interrogated would reveal complicated and detailed descriptions of their political life, but also often their personal life. The relationships within the home were key indicators about the extent to which somebody had held on to anti-revolutionary bourgeois thoughts. Drinking, domestic violence, lateness at work, poor workmanship, spitting, swearing, these kind of anti-Kulturnost sort of values or behaviours were key indicators that somebody had not got on board with Stalin's Cultural Revolution. The confession itself was unlike the normal Christian or Catholic confession, in that there's no absolution at the end of it. Nobody says, "Well, you confessed your sins. You're on the right side of history again now." No. Instead, the only expectation that somebody who was speaking up or confessing might have is that the commission might be merciful. Lucky individuals were sent away with a warning. They were given a good telling off. However, the problem with this was that their details were kept on file, and it was these individuals that survived the purge that weren't arrested that would be the low-hanging fruit for the secret police after 1936. These were the people whom, when there were quotas for arrests, they simply looked through the files for people that had been interrogated and had a ticking off before, and they were the first to be arrested, often the first to be shot. There's an interesting facet to the origins of the show trials. The initial show trials in the 1920s were not performances that resulted in actual real sentences. Instead, these were events that happened in workplaces, in villages, and in communities across Russia, where local party officials would put somebody on trial, perhaps somebody with dubious class origins, or somebody in a workplace that had been involved in a breakage or a spillage or some kind of perceived act of hooliganism or sabotage. And the person would be, it was almost a ritual humiliation more than anything else. That person would be forced to take part in a kind of a bit of theatre. It wasn't about establishing guilt or innocence. There isn't a kind of a sort of a process of jurisprudence as we have in democratic societies, where evidence is evaluated by a jury and a judge directs a jury to discount certain things, and there are procedures and practices. None of that. Guilt or innocence doesn't really matter. Guilt's already been decided beforehand. The purpose of the show trial was to really create a theatre out of the hideousness of the crime. Show trial is a very emotional process where people are, the audience to the trial is kind of prompted to whip itself up into paroxysms of anger and fury over the villainous nature of the accused. However, initially, people weren't sent to prison, people weren't executed. That wasn't the point. It was about showing the audience that there were class traitors in their midst, or that there were people who were engaged in sabotage. And normally those people who are accused of sabotage were people that dropped a spanner into an engine or something like that, or people that were so tired at work through the kind of the overwork that they were subjected to that they made mistakes. The first major central political show trial happened in 1923, and it was the right SRs, the right social revolutionaries. The left SRs obviously allied themselves with the Bolsheviks, but the right SRs who had fought the Bolsheviks during the Civil War were put on trial then. The later wave of show trials began towards the end of the 1920s, the most significant first one obviously being the Shakti trial in 1928, and the Industrial Party in 1930, the Industrial Party trial in 1930, and the Metro Vickers trial, where British engineers were accused of espionage working on the Moscow metro. Of course, one of the key features of the Industrial Party trial and the Shakti trial is all of the charges are completely fictitious and obtained through obviously torture and duress, and the accused either received death penalties or long periods of imprisonment, and all obviously confess their guilt and play along with the pantomime for various kind of traumatized reasons. And then finally there are the Moscow trials in the Great Purges period. The Zinoviev-Kamenev trial of 1936, the Pyatakov trial of 1937, and the Bukharin trial of 1938, where, of course, it wasn't ordinary people being put on trial, or even what were allegedly bourgeois specialists, but the elite tier of the party who had come through the revolution with Stalin. And the extent to which Stalin actually believed any of this is a difficult one to answer. Stalin writes in his correspondence as if he does believe it's true, but the historian Terry Martin suggests that probably for the top leadership, the trials made not a literal truth, but a kind of a metaphorical one, a psychological one. People like Stalin thought, well, Bukharin hasn't been allied with Trotsky and hasn't been colluding with foreign powers to overthrow the country, literally, but he can't be trusted anyway and doesn't really have the interests of the revolution at his heart, and is a graspy, power-hungry type, and generally a bad Soviet citizen, and so he really should face some rather extreme revolutionary justice. Many ordinary people, of course, did take them seriously, and it's hardly surprising when even Western intellectuals, on looking at the show trials, gave them an absolute kind of clean bill of health. Sidney and Beatrice Webb, the British Fabians and fellow travellers, write in their book Soviet Communism, A New Civilization, that the accused in the show trials must have done something, and that the show trials are a harsh but proportionate response to all the sabotage that's happening in the Soviet Union, and that there is no other way to deal with saboteurs. And these are people who were decidedly on the liberal left of British politics, and for reasons best known to themselves, or their reasons motivated by a kind of a view of modernity and the place of Soviet communism within it, were endlessly sympathetic to Stalinism. The obsession that the top tier of Stalin's inner circle and Stalin's secret police had with infiltration, with conspiracy, is partly to do with the nature of the revolution itself. There was a belief that the revolution hadn't really achieved all the things that it was meant to, and the reason behind this was because it had been stabbed in the back, it had been sabotaged somehow. And the kind of the veneration of Lenin meant that everything that had happened after Lenin's death appeared to have been kind of on a slowly descending trajectory. In Everyday Stalinism, Sheila Fitzpatrick quotes a conversation between a former secret policeman, a former Chekist, and the revolutionary dissident and exile Victor Serge. By the way, if you want to read really interesting accounts, not just of the Russian Revolution, but of Europe in the 20s and 30s, read Memoirs of a Revolutionary by Victor Serge. It's amazing, amazing writing. Anyway, Serge revealed their conversation. He said, "The secret is that everything has been betrayed," said the Checker man. "From the years when Lenin was alive, treason has wormed its way into the Central Committee. He knows the names, he has the proof. At the peril of his life, he is submitting his analysis of the gigantic crime studied over years to the Central Committee. He whispers the name of foreigners, of the most powerful capitalists, and of others which have an occult significance for him. I follow his chain of reasoning with the secret uneasiness that one feels in the presence of some lunatic logician. But in all that he says, he is driven by one basic idea, which is not the idea of a madman. We did not create the revolution to come to this." So even though this former Checker man might seem irrational, might seem to have lost his sense of what is real, and might be what we would describe as a conspiracy theorist now. He was not alone within the party and within the Soviet government. There was a belief, by and large, that the revolution was not working as intended because it was constantly being undermined. And it was being undermined by conspirators, both inside and outside the Soviet Union, and these must be hunted for relentlessly. And the task of good Stalinists, good Soviet citizens, was to unmask the conspirators that were within our midst, that talked to you as if they were friends one day, but they were really working against you and the rest of society. And they had an obsessional hatred of the Soviet Union, these conspirators, and they were making everything fail. The reason why nothing was really working effectively in the Soviet Union must be conspiracy, because the revolution couldn't be at fault. There must be someone to blame. Of course, the regime did have enemies, fairly impotent and powerless ones, but enemies that it had created by categorizing entire social classes, such as the nobility, the bourgeoisie, priests, and then later the kulaks, as class enemies who were resentful of their loss of privilege and looking to overthrow the state. At the end of the 1920s was the next phase in dealing with these undesirables who'd kind of, in the eyes of the regime, lingered on since the revolution and hadn't been properly got rid of. And from 1928 onwards moves towards class liquidation, of the wiping out of categories of enemies, particularly the kulaks. But also, if you read Doug Smith's brilliant book, Former People, he points out that by the middle of the 1930s, the entirety, and those that had, with the exception of those that had fled, the entirety of the former nobility had been wiped out. And he says, if you take the former nobility and the people who worked closely with them, their household staff, and those people's extended families who were all eliminated, he said you're looking at perhaps 1 or 2 million people. The war against the kulaks, against net men, and against the former people and priests was a very different kind of purge. This wasn't the purging of the party, but the purging of society itself. And I will go into the kind of anti-kulak campaigns in greater depth at some point in the near future, because obviously they require kind of a lot greater analysis. Stalin realised in the late 1930s that a member of an enemy class didn't really become more likely to become a loyal Soviet citizen as a result of the purging. And so there were processes of relaxation, of purges, of dialing, of the reduction in oppression periodically. As Stalin realised that, particularly with the anti-kulak campaigns, that those that hadn't been rounded up into the gulags or killed simply fled across the country and reinvented themselves as proletarians and hid in towns and cities, and became hidden enemies, so far more dangerous. In general, it's hardly surprising that the Bolsheviks and later the Stalinists thought in terms of conspiracy, because their years as exiles, as parts of the revolutionary underground, were an education in conspiracy, and they were the conspirators. And so part of the institutional paranoia of the revolutionary underground then crosses over into the process of building the new communist state. Okay, well, I hope you found that useful. Do swing by the Explaining History Facebook page and say hi. We had some great conversations there recently, and some really interesting folks have brought ideas to the fore, and debated and discussed. And it's a really nice forum. So do swing by there, and you can catch up with some of the videos I'm putting online for students as well. Anyway, I hope you find this useful, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Bye bye.